The blood dripped slowly from Victoria Parker's trembling fingers as she gripped the counter of her father's general store, her gaze fixed on the ledger before her. It wasn't her blood, but her father's, who now lay still on the floor behind her, his chest no longer rising with breath. The year was 1876, and Canon City, Colorado, was supposed to have been their fresh start after the war took everything else from them, not the place where she would lose the only family she had left. Victoria pushed a strand of her auburn hair from her face, leaving a crimson smear across her cheek. The thundering of horse hooves had faded into the distance long ago, along with the three men who had decided her father's refusal to pay protection money was worthy of a death sentence. She knew their faces. Everyone in Canon City knew the Blackburn Gang, ruthless men who terrorized the area while the sheriff conveniently looked the other way, his pockets heavy with their bribes. Her father's body needed tending, but Victoria couldn't move. The shop was in ruins, merchandise scattered across the wooden floor, mingling with broken glass and spilled flour. The gang had made it clear they'd be back in a week for the property deed. Her father had spent every penny they had to build this place. Without it, she had nothing. "What am I going to do?" she whispered to the empty store, her voice cracking. The townspeople were too afraid to stand against the Blackburns. The law was corrupted. At 22, Victoria had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The walls of the store seemed to close in around her as the reality of her situation became unbearably clear. The bell above the door jingled, startling her. Victoria reached for her father's shotgun that lay discarded on the floor, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Had they returned already? A tall man ducked through the doorway, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before him. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, moved from the destruction to Victoria's blood-stained face, then to her father's body, and finally to the shotgun now pointed in his direction. "Madam," he said softly, raising his hands slowly, "I don't mean any harm." Victoria's hands shook as she kept the gun leveled at him. "The store is closed," she managed, her voice barely audible. The stranger's gaze softened as he took in her tear-streaked face. With careful movements, he closed the door behind him, then turned the sign to closed. "My name is Preston Bailey," he corrected himself quickly. "I just arrived in town." He nodded toward her father. "Looks like you need help." Victoria let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "No one in this town can help me, mister, not against the Blackburns." The stranger's jaw tightened at the mention of the name, but he kept his voice gentle. "Let me help," he said simply, taking a step toward her. The shotgun wavered in her grip as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why would you?" "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered, carefully lowering her gun with one hand while the other reached for a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "And right now, you need to sit down before you fall down." Victoria stared at him. This stranger who had walked into her nightmare offering assistance when everyone else in town would be barricading their doors. Something in his steady gaze made her want to believe he was different. She desperately needed someone to be different. "I don't even know you," she whispered, but allowed him to take the gun. "No, madam, you don't," he agreed, guiding her to a chair. "But I know trouble when I see it, and I reckon you've got more than your fair share right now." As he gently cleaned the blood from her hands with his handkerchief, Victoria found herself telling him everything about her father's refusal to pay, about the sheriff's corruption, about the Blackburns' ultimatum to return for the deed. Preston listened quietly, his face growing more solemn with each detail. "What's your name?" he asked when she'd finished. Victoria Parker," he nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Well, Miss Parker, first things first, we need to tend to your father and you need rest. The rest we'll figure out together." "There is no we," Victoria said, pulling her hands away. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Bailey, but when word gets out about what happened here, no one will want to be associated with me. The Blackburns run this town." Preston's blue eyes hardened slightly as he stood, surveying the destroyed store. "Not for long," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Then he turned back to her, his expression determined. "Everyone needs somebody sometimes, Miss Parker. Today, I'm that somebody for you. Tomorrow, we'll see about changing the odds." For the first time since the attack, Victoria felt a tiny flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not quite, but it was something close to it. This stranger, this cowboy who had appeared from nowhere, was offering what no one else would: help against impossible odds. Why? She asked again, needing to understand. Preston adjusted his hat, a shadow crossing his features. Let's just say I've got my reasons for not being fond of men like the Blackburns. Now, is there someone who can help us with your father? Victoria thought of old Dr. Morris, who lived on the edge of town. He was one of the few honest men left in Canon City. Yes, she said, standing on shaky legs. I know someone. Good, Preston nodded. Then we've got a place to start. As they prepared to move her father's body, Victoria couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious cowboy really was, and why fate had brought him to her door at her darkest moment. She didn't know if he could truly help her against the Blackburns, but for now she was no longer facing her nightmare alone. The next morning arrived with a relentless brightness that seemed to mock Victoria's grief. She had spent the night at Dr. Morris's home after the elderly physician had helped Preston bring her father's body there. The doctor's wife, Martha, had given Victoria a sleeping draught that had granted her a few hours of dreamless rest, but waking brought the horror of reality crashing back. Her father was dead. The store was destroyed, and in 6 days the Blackburns would return for the deed. Victoria, dressed in the simple black dress Martha had lent her, and made her way downstairs, where low voices could be heard from the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, observing the unexpected scene. Preston Bailey sat at the doctor's table, a map of Canon City spread before him, deep in conversation with Dr. Morris. Both men looked up when she entered. Miss Parker, Preston stood immediately, pulling out a chair for her. How are you feeling? It was such a ridiculous question that Victoria almost laughed. I'm alive, she answered simply, taking the offered seat. Dr. Morris patted her hand sympathetically. I've sent word to Reverend Williams. We can have the funeral tomorrow if that suits you. Victoria nodded, her throat tight. Thank you, doctor, and thank you for taking us in. It's the least we could do, Martha said as she placed a cup of coffee in front of Victoria. Your father was a good man. One of the few left in this town, Dr. Morris added with a scowl. Ever since the Blackburns moved in 3 years ago, everything's changed. Decent folk are either scared silent or they've moved on. Preston's eyes narrowed. How many men do they have? 5, including the 3 brothers, Dr. Morris replied. Jeb Blackburn is the oldest, mean as a rattlesnake. Then there's Lyle and Emmett. The other 2 are hired guns. One's called Simmons, the other one's a Mexican fellow, goes by El Lobo. Victoria stared into her coffee, and our sheriff is firmly in their pocket. Sheriff Wilson was a good lawman once, Dr. Morris sighed. But he's got a gambling problem and a wife with expensive tastes. The Blackburns own him now. Preston rolled up the map deliberately. What about the marshal's office in Denver? Can't they send someone? We've tried, Martha said, her expression bitter. Letters go missing. Anyone who travels there with complaints seems to have accidents on the road back. The last man who tried ended up face down in the river. Victoria looked up at Preston. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than in the chaos of yesterday. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. His clothes were dusty but of good quality, and the gun belt at his hip looked well worn. You should leave town, Mr. Bailey, she said quietly. I appreciate what you've done, but this isn't your fight. Preston met her gaze steadily. I don't run from fights, Miss Parker. They'll kill you, she insisted. Just like they killed my father. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I'm harder to kill than most. Dr. Morris cleared his throat. Victoria, there's the matter of the store and your living arrangements. Martha and I would be happy to have you stay with us for as long as needed. Victoria shook her head. Thank you, but I need to go back to the store. There might be something salvageable, and I need to decide what to do. I'll come with you, Preston said immediately. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. Dr. Morris looked between them, concern evident in his aged face. Be careful. The Blackburns have eyes everywhere. Preston stood, settling his hat on his head. I always am, Doctor, Miss Parker, whenever you're ready. The walk back to the general store was tense. Victoria felt exposed on the main street, aware of curious and sometimes sympathetic glances from townsfolk who had heard about the attack. No one approached them, however, and several people actively crossed to the other side of the street to avoid interaction. "Your town has a strong sense of community," Preston observed dryly. Victoria felt a flash of defensive loyalty. "They're scared. Not everyone can afford to be brave. And what about you? Are you scared?" She looked up at him, his tall form blocking the morning sun. "Terrified. But I'm also angry. My father built that store from nothing after we lost everything in the war. He didn't deserve to die over it." "No," Preston agreed, his voice hardening. "He didn't." When they reached the general store, Victoria hesitated before unlocking the door. The memory of her father's last moments was still vivid, and she wasn't sure she could face the blood-stained floor again. Preston seemed to sense her reluctance. "I can go in first," he offered. "Make sure it's decent." Swallowing hard, Victoria handed him the key. "Thank you." Preston entered alone, and she heard him moving about inside for several minutes. When he returned to the door, his shirt sleeves were rolled up and there was a determined set to his jaw. "I've cleared the worst of it," he said simply. "It's safe to come in now." The store was still in disarray, but Preston had indeed cleaned the blood from the floor. Someone, likely Preston himself, had swept up the broken glass and righted the shelves. The merchandise was still scattered, but the violent evidence of her father's murder had been removed as much as possible. Victoria's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "Thank you," she whispered. Preston nodded, then gestured to the store ledger that sat on the counter. "Your father kept good records. From what I can see, the business was doing well." "It was," Victoria confirmed, running her fingers over the leather-bound book. "We were finally starting to get ahead. That's why the Blackburns came. They always know who has money." "And the deed, where is it kept?" Victoria hesitated. "Why do you want to know?" Preston's expression remained neutral. "Because the Blackburns want it, which means we need to secure it." "We, Miss Parker," Preston said, leaning against the counter. "I understand your caution, but I'm not going anywhere, not until this is resolved." "You keep saying that," Victoria said, frustration creeping into her voice. "But you haven't explained why. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? What's your stake in this?" For a long moment, Preston was silent, his blue eyes studying her face as if searching for something. Finally, he straightened, coming to a decision. "My name is Preston Bailey, and that's the truth. But what I didn't tell you is that I used to be a Texas Ranger." He unbuttoned the top of his shirt just enough to reveal a star-shaped scar near his collarbone. "Until men like the Blackburns ambushed my partner and me near El Paso 2 years ago. They killed him, left me for dead." Victoria's breath caught. "You're hunting them?" "Not exactly," Preston said, buttoning his shirt. "I recovered and went back to work for a while, but I couldn't. I wasn't the same. I turned in my badge 6 months ago, been drifting since, taking odd jobs. When I heard about Canon City having troubles with a gang called the Blackburns, I thought I might be able to help." "So you came here intentionally," Victoria realized. Preston nodded. "I've seen too many good people crushed under the boots of men like them. Your father wasn't the first, and he won't be the last unless someone stands up. And you think you can do that? One former ranger against 5 killers and a corrupt sheriff." A slow smile spread across Preston's face, not reaching his eyes. "I don't plan to face them alone. This town needs to find its backbone, Miss Parker. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take the first stand." Victoria felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. This man, this former lawman, had ridden into her life like something from a dime novel, offering hope when she'd believed there was none. It was dangerous, perhaps foolish, to trust him, but what choice did she have? "The deed is hidden in my father's room," she finally said. "Behind a loose brick in the fireplace." Preston nodded. "Good, leave it there for now. Is there a back room here where you can stay?" "Yes, there's living quarters behind the store, but I'm not sure I want to stay here tonight." "I understand," Preston said gently. "But it might be better if the Blackburns believe you're continuing as normal. If you disappear, they might get suspicious and move up their timeline." Victoria knew he was right, logical though the idea of sleeping where her father had been murdered made her stomach churn. I'll need to clean up the living area first. I'll help, Preston offered. And then I need to make some inquiries around town, get the lay of the land. Be careful, Victoria warned. The Blackburns have informants everywhere. Preston's expression was grim. I'm counting on it. Word travels fast in small towns. By nightfall, they'll know there's a stranger asking questions. And that's what you want. It's a start, he said cryptically. Now let's get this place in order so you can reopen tomorrow. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Reopen? My father isn't even buried yet. Preston's gaze softened. I know it seems heartless, Miss Parker, but we need to establish that you're staying and fighting for what's yours. The store is your livelihood. Keeping it closed only serves the Blackburns' interests. Victoria wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Her father would want her to keep the store running. It was their dream, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Closing now would dishonor his memory. All right, she agreed. We'll reopen the day after the funeral. Preston nodded. In the meantime, I'll see what I can learn about our adversaries, and perhaps find out if there are any in this town with the courage to join us. As they worked side by side to restore order to the store, Victoria found herself watching Preston when he wasn't looking. There was something compelling about him beyond his obvious physical strengths, a sense of quiet purpose that drew her in despite her wariness. She had no reason to trust this stranger except for the fact that when she had believed no one would help, he had walked in and said those simple words, "Let me help." Whether his help would be enough to save her remained to be seen. But for the first time since her father's murder, Victoria felt something other than despair. It was dangerous to hope, she knew, but perhaps more dangerous not to. Thomas Parker was laid to rest on a quiet hilltop overlooking Canon City the following day. The funeral was better attended than Victoria had expected, though she noticed many people casting nervous glances toward the back of the gathering, where Sheriff Wilson stood with his arms crossed, obviously taking note of who had come to pay respects. Preston stood beside Victoria throughout the service, a solid presence that somehow made the unbearable slightly more bearable. He had appeared at Dr. Morris's door that morning dressed in a clean black coat, his usually unruly hair combed neatly beneath his hat. Victoria had been touched by the gesture. This man, who barely knew them, had still shown her father the respect of proper funeral attire. As Reverend Williams spoke the final prayers, Victoria felt Preston's hand lightly touch her elbow. Following his gaze, she noticed 3 riders watching the proceedings from a distant ridge. The Blackburns, she whispered. Preston gave an almost imperceptible nod. 2 of them, Jeb and Lyle. If the descriptions I've heard are accurate, the third is probably Simmons. Victoria shivered despite the warm spring air. They're making sure I see them. Yes, it's a message. Preston's voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. They want you afraid. It's working, she admitted. His hand moved to the small of her back, a reassuring pressure. Fear keeps you alert. Just don't let it paralyze you. After the service, several townsfolk approached Victoria with condolences. Most seemed genuine, though hurried, as if afraid to be seen speaking with her for too long. The town blacksmith, a burly man named Samuel Cooper, clasped her hand firmly. Your father was a good man, Miss Parker, one of the best I knew. His voice lowered. If there's anything you need, you come see me. Victoria was startled by the offer. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. As the blacksmith moved away, Sheriff Wilson approached. He was a tall, once handsome man whose features had grown bloated with drink and corruption. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, a mockery of the office it represented. Miss Parker, he said, tipping his hat. His gaze shifted to Preston. Don't believe we've met, stranger. Preston Bailey, Preston replied, not offering his hand. Just passing through, the sheriff's eyes narrowed. Staying long enough. Victoria could feel the tension crackling between the 2 men. Sheriff Wilson turned his attention back to her, his expression a poor attempt at sympathy. Terrible business, what happened to your father. Robbery gone wrong, I suspect. It wasn't a robbery, Victoria said coldly. You know exactly what it was and who did it. The sheriff's face hardened. Careful with accusations, Miss Parker. This town has laws against slander. Funny, Preston remarked. I thought it had laws against murder too. Sheriff Wilson's hand drifted toward his gun. "You do well to mind your own business, Bailey. Canon City doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." "Seems to me it takes kindly to certain kinds of trouble," Preston replied evenly. "Just not the kind that involves justice." The sheriff's face flushed with anger. "I am the law in this town. You do well to remember that. A law that serves criminals isn't law at all," Preston said quietly. "It's just another form of crime." For a moment, Victoria thought the sheriff might draw his weapon right there at the graveside. Instead, he turned to her with a cold smile. "Miss Parker, I heard you're reopening the store tomorrow. That's mighty soon after your loss." "I have a living to make," Victoria replied stiffly. "Indeed, just be careful. Accidents happen in businesses all the time, fires, break-ins." He touched the brim of his hat again. "Good day to you both." As the sheriff walked away, Victoria released a shaky breath. That was a threat. "Yes, it was," Preston agreed. "And a clumsy one. He's rattled." "By you," Preston's eyes followed the sheriff's retreating form. "By the idea that someone might upset the comfortable arrangement he has with the Blackburns." Dr. Morris approached them, his wife on his arm. "That looked tense," he observed. "The sheriff was expressing his heartfelt condolences," Preston said dryly. Martha Morris clicked her tongue. "That man. There was a time when James Wilson was an honest lawman. Now look at him doing the bidding of those outlaws. Speaking of, Doctor." Morris nodded toward the ridge where the riders had been. "They're gone now, but they made sure to be seen." Victoria squared her shoulders. "They want me frightened into giving up the store." "And are you?" Martha asked gently. Victoria glanced at Preston, drawing strength from his steady gaze. "I'm frightened," she admitted, "but I'm not giving up. My father built that store. I won't let them take it." "Good girl," Dr. Morris said approvingly. "Your father would be proud." As the small gathering dispersed, Preston offered Victoria his arm. "I'll walk you back to the store." The formality of the gesture struck Victoria as oddly comforting, a reminder of civilized behavior in a situation that felt increasingly lawless. She placed her hand on his arm, noting the solid muscle beneath the black coat. "What's our next move?" she asked as they walked down the hill toward town. Preston was quiet for a moment, considering. "Tomorrow, we reopen the store as planned. I've been making inquiries, and I believe there are at least a few people in this town who are tired of living under the Blackburns' thumb. Like Mr. Cooper, him for one, and the saloon keeper Jenkins, his daughter was mistreated by Emmett Blackburn last year. No one did anything about it." Victoria's heart sank. "That poor girl. Jenkins has been looking for a way to fight back ever since. He just needed someone to rally behind." "And that's you?" Victoria asked, looking up at his profile. Preston shook his head. "No, Miss Parker, that's you." Victoria stopped walking. "Me, I'm just a storekeeper's daughter." "You're more than that," Preston said, turning to face her. "You're someone who's standing her ground when everyone else is backing down. That makes you dangerous to men like the Blackburns." "It also makes me a target," she pointed out. "Yes," Preston acknowledged. "Which is why I'll be staying in the room above the stables behind your store. Close enough to help if trouble comes, but not so close as to damage your reputation." Victoria felt her cheeks warm at the implication. It hadn't occurred to her how it might look to have an unmarried man staying in her home, even in these circumstances. "Thank you for your consideration," she said formally. "Though I think my reputation is the least of my concerns right now." A small smile tugged at Preston's lips. "Maybe so, but your father struck me as the type of man who would have cared about such things, even in a crisis." The observation was so accurate that Victoria felt a fresh wave of grief. "Yes," she whispered. "He would have." They continued walking in silence until they reached the store. Victoria paused at the door, turning to Preston with the question that had been nagging at her since the funeral. "What happens when the Blackburns come for the deed? We only have 5 days left." Preston's expression grew serious. "By then, I hope to have enough of the town on our side to make them think twice, but if not..." His hand rested briefly on his gun. "I've handled worse odds." "I can't ask you to kill for me," Victoria said, horrified at the thought. "You didn't ask," Preston replied simply. "But some men only understand one language, Miss Parker. The Blackburns have been speaking it fluently for years. Sometimes the only way to stop them is to speak back in kind." Victoria looked at this man who had walked into her life 2 days ago and was now prepared to risk everything for her cause. It was reckless, perhaps even foolish, but she couldn't deny the hope his presence gave her. 5 days, she said softly. Let's hope it's enough time. Preston's blue eyes held hers. Time is what we make of it, Miss Parker, and I intend to make the most of every minute we have. As he tipped his hat and walked toward the stables, Victoria watched him go, aware of a fluttering sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was dangerous to feel anything for this man who might be gone as quickly as he had appeared. But Victoria was beginning to realize that some dangers couldn't be avoided, they could only be faced, head-on and with courage, just like the danger that would come calling in 5 days' time. The general store reopened the next morning as planned. Victoria had spent the previous evening cleaning and reorganizing, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the space where her life had shattered. Preston had helped silently, moving heavy shelves and crates, fixing broken fixtures, and mounting a new bolt on the back door just in case, as he had put it. Now, as Victoria unlocked the front door and turned the sign to open, she felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. This store had been her father's pride, and now it was her battleground. Preston had left before dawn, mentioning something about seeing a man about some supplies. Victoria hadn't questioned him, understanding instinctively that the less she knew about certain aspects of his plan, the better. Their silent agreement was that she would handle the store while he worked on gathering allies and information. The morning passed slowly. Few customers ventured in, though Victoria noticed several people walking by, glancing in the windows with a mixture of curiosity and pity. By noon, she had completed only 3 small transactions, a far cry from their usual business. The Blackburn's message was clear: associate with Victoria Parker at your own risk. Just as she was considering closing for lunch, the door opened and Lily Jenkins entered. The young woman was the daughter of the saloon owner, a pretty girl of 19 whose eyes now carried a wariness beyond her years. Victoria knew immediately that this must be the girl Preston had mentioned, the one who had suffered at Emmett Blackburn's hands. "Miss Jenkins," Victoria greeted her, surprised. "How can I help you?" Lily glanced nervously over her shoulder before approaching the counter. "I need some cloth for a new dress," she said in a voice loud enough to be heard by anyone listening. Then, in a whisper, she added, "My father sent me. He wants to meet with you and Mr. Bailey tonight, after closing." Victoria maintained a neutral expression as she moved toward the fabric bolts. "I have some lovely calico that would suit you," she said normally. Then, quietly, "Tell him we'll be there." Lily nodded, selecting a length of blue fabric. As Victoria cut and wrapped it, the younger woman spoke softly. "I'm sorry about your father. He was always kind to me." "Thank you," Victoria replied, touched by the sentiment. "Is it true what they're saying?" "That you're going to fight the Blackburns?" Victoria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm not giving them my store," she finally said. A flash of admiration crossed Lily's face. "Good. Someone needs to stand up to them." Her voice dropped even lower. "After what Emmett did to me, my father wanted to kill him, but we knew they'd just burn down the saloon and hang Pa from the nearest tree." Victoria's heart ached for the girl. "I'm so sorry, Lily." "Don't be sorry," Lily said fiercely. "Just help us fight them. Mr. Bailey seems to think we can win." "And what do you think?" Lily considered this as she paid for her fabric. "I think it's about time we tried." After Lily left, the store remained empty for much of the afternoon. Victoria used the time to take inventory, trying to calculate how long she could keep the business running with their dwindling supplies and diminished customer base. The figures were not encouraging. Just before closing time, the bell above the door jingled and Victoria looked up to see Samuel Cooper, the blacksmith, entering. His massive frame seemed to fill the small space and his expression was troubled. "Miss Parker," he greeted, removing his hat. "I need a word if you don't mind." "Of course, Mr. Cooper." The blacksmith glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I hear you're having a meeting tonight at Jenkins' place." Victoria stiffened. "News travels fast, too fast," Cooper agreed grimly, "which is why I'm here. You should know that El Lobo was asking questions about your friend Bailey in the saloon this morning, describing him, wanting to know where he came from. A chill ran through Victoria. What did people say? Not much. Nobody knows anything about him. Cooper leaned closer. But the Mexican seemed mighty interested, said something about Bailey looking familiar. Victoria's mind raced. Could the Blackburn's hired gun recognize Preston from his ranger days? Thank you for telling me, Cooper nodded. There's something else. Sheriff Wilson's been riding out to the Blackburn ranch twice a day since your pa died. Something's brewing. They're planning something, Victoria murmured. They're not waiting the full week. That'd be my guess. Cooper placed his hat back on his head. I'll be at Jenkins tonight. My apprentice, too. He's young, but he's good with a gun. Victoria was touched by the blacksmith's support. It's dangerous to get involved, Mr. Cooper. A sad smile crossed the man's weathered face. Your father helped my family when we first came to Canon City. Gave us credit when no one else would. I couldn't help him when he needed it, but I can help his daughter. After Cooper left, Victoria closed the store, her mind troubled by this new information. She needed to warn Preston that one of the Blackburn's men might recognize him. She locked the front door and headed toward the stables, where Preston had made his temporary lodging. The small room above the stables was sparsely furnished, but Preston had made it functional with minimal belongings. When Victoria knocked on the door, he opened it immediately as if he'd been expecting her. Miss Parker, he said, surprise evident in his voice. Is everything all right? Victoria explained what Cooper had told her, watching as Preston's expression darkened. El Lobo, he muttered. I was hoping he wouldn't remember me. So he does know you, Preston sighed, gesturing for her to enter the small room. We had an encounter in Texas about 3 years back. I was part of a ranger party that broke up a smuggling operation he was running near the border. He escaped, but several of his men were hanged. Victoria sat on the room's only chair, feeling suddenly weary. So he has a personal grudge against you. You could say that. Preston ran a hand through his hair. This complicates things, but it doesn't change the plan. If anything, it might work to our advantage. How could this possibly be an advantage? Victoria asked incredulously. Preston's eyes took on a calculating gleam. If El Lobo recognizes me, the Blackburns will be nervous. They might make mistakes. Or they might just shoot you on sight, Victoria countered. A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. They can try. Victoria was not comforted by his confidence. Mr. Bailey, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I can't have your death on my conscience. Perhaps we should. It's not your decision to make, Miss Parker, Preston interrupted gently. I knew the risks when I came to Canon City. This changes nothing. Victoria wanted to argue further, but something in his expression stopped her. This was a man accustomed to danger, to making difficult choices. She had no right to make those choices for him. Jenkins wants to meet tonight, she said instead. At the saloon after closing, Preston nodded. Good, Cooper told me he'd be there too. And I've spoken with a few others who might be willing to help. How many? Not as many as I'd like, Preston admitted, but more than the Blackburns will expect. This town has been under their thumb for too long. Some people are ready to fight back. Victoria studied him, this strange, determined man who had appointed himself her protector. In just a few days, he had given her something she'd thought lost forever, hope. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you're doing. Preston looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. Don't thank me yet, Miss Parker. This is far from over. Victoria, she said suddenly. Please call me Victoria. After all we've been through, Miss Parker seems overly formal. Preston's eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their blue depths. Victoria, he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. The way he said it, with a gentle inflection that no one else had ever used, sent an unexpected warmth through her. It was inappropriate, she knew, to feel anything beyond gratitude toward this man. Her father was barely in his grave, and her life was in danger. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Preston Bailey, a pull that went beyond his promise of protection. I should go, she said, standing abruptly. I need to prepare for the meeting. Preston nodded, a shadow of something regret, disappointment, crossing his features. I'll come for you at 8. Lock your doors until then. As Victoria walked back to the store, she tried to steady her racing heart. She couldn't afford distraction, not with so much at stake. Preston Bailey was here to help her fight the Blackburns, nothing more. Whatever she might feel for him was irrelevant. Yet as she prepared for the evening ahead, Victoria couldn't help but wonder what would happen when this was all over, assuming they survived. Would Preston simply ride away, another town to save, another wrong to right? The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. 5 days until the Blackburns came for the deed. 5 days that could change everything or end everything. Victoria only knew one thing for certain. When the time came, she would stand her ground, just as her father had. And unlike him, she would not stand alone. Jenkins' saloon after hours was a different place from the rowdy establishment Victoria had occasionally glimpsed through its windows. With the lamps turned low and the piano silent, it had an almost church-like solemnity that suited the gravity of their meeting. Henry Jenkins himself stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with methodical precision as they waited for everyone to arrive. His daughter, Lily, moved quietly among the tables, setting out coffee cups instead of whiskey glasses. The young woman's movements were efficient but nervous, her eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. Victoria sat beside Preston at a corner table, watching as Samuel Cooper arrived with his apprentice, a strapping young man named Caleb. Dr. Morris followed shortly after, without his wife, but carrying his medical bag, a silent acknowledgement of what might lie ahead. Reverend Williams was a surprise addition, his clerical collar stark against his dark coat. The minister nodded gravely to Victoria as he took a seat. One by one, others filtered in. The telegraph operator, a cattle buyer passing through town, 2 ranch hands who had apparently harbored grudges against the Blackburns. And finally, to Victoria's astonishment, Mrs. Abernathy, the prim widow who ran the town's small hotel. 15, Preston murmured, tallying the attendants. More than I expected. Jenkins cleared his throat, calling the gathering to order. Folks, I think we all know why we're here. The Blackburns have had their boot on this town's neck for too long. Miss Parker's father was the latest victim, but he won't be the last unless something changes. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Jenkins continued, Mr. Bailey here has a plan. I've heard it and I think it could work, but it'll take all of us and it'll be dangerous. All eyes turned to Preston, who stood, his presence commanding the room without effort. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, he began. The Blackburns are killers. They've got numbers, they've got the law on their side, and they've got nothing to lose. What we have is the element of surprise and moral right. Moral right doesn't stop bullets, Caleb, the apprentice blacksmith, interjected. No, Preston agreed, but it gives us something worth fighting for. That counts for more than you might think. He unfolded a rough map of Canon City and the surrounding area, placing it on a central table where everyone could see. The Blackburns operate from their ranch 5 miles east of town. They typically ride in as a group, intimidate whoever their target is, then leave together. Sheriff Wilson warns them of any trouble brewing, so they're rarely caught off guard. So what's your plan? Dr. Morris asked. Preston's eyes met Victoria's briefly before he continued. We let them come for the deed as planned. But instead of finding Miss Parker alone and defenseless, they'll find us waiting, not just at the store but positioned throughout town. An ambush, Samuel Cooper said, nodding approvingly. Precisely. The Blackburns are used to facing one frightened victim at a time. They won't expect organized resistance. Mrs. Abernathy spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady for such a delicate-looking woman. And what of Sheriff Wilson? He'll warn them. Preston smiled grimly. The sheriff will be indisposed when the time comes. You can't just lock up the law, the telegraph operator protested. When the law is corrupt, it's not really the law anymore, Reverend Williams said quietly. Scripture tells us there are higher authorities than man's laws. Victoria was surprised by the minister's support but grateful for it. The room fell into discussion, some voices skeptical, others determined. Preston answered questions with patient authority, addressing concerns and adjusting the plan based on suggestions. Victoria watched him work, impressed by his ability to unite these disparate individuals toward a common purpose. As the meeting progressed, specific roles were assigned. Cooper and his apprentice would block the main road with an overturned wagon if the Blackburns tried to flee. Jenkins and his regular customers would provide additional gunmen. Dr. Morris would stand ready to treat any injuries. Even Mrs. Abernathy had a role. Her hotel overlooked the main street, providing an excellent vantage point for a lookout. "What about me?" Victoria asked when Preston hadn't mentioned her part. A hush fell over the room. Preston's expression turned grave. "You'll be in the store as they expect, but not alone." "I want to fight," she insisted. "They killed my father." "I understand," Preston said gently. "But you're what they're coming for. We need you visible, drawing them in." Victoria didn't like it, but she recognized the logic. "Fine, but I won't be helpless. My father taught me to shoot." Preston nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." "But your primary role is to keep them talking, keep them inside the store until our people are in position." As the meeting concluded, Preston pulled Victoria aside. "There's something we haven't discussed," he said in a low voice. "What happens if this goes wrong?" Victoria's stomach clenched. "You mean if they kill us all?" "If things turn against us," Preston amended, "you need to be prepared to run. I've arranged for a horse to be ready behind the store. Head for Denver, find Marshal Collins. He's an old friend, he'll help you." Victoria shook her head. "I'm not running." "Victoria," Preston said, his voice urgent, his hand closing around her arm. "Promise me, your father wouldn't want you to die for a piece of property." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "And what about you? Will you run too?" A shadow crossed Preston's face. "My path is set. Has been since El Paso." "That's not fair," Victoria protested. "You can't ask me to save myself while you sacrifice yourself." "I'm not planning on dying," Preston said with a hint of his usual confidence. "But if things go south, someone needs to make sure the Blackburns eventually face justice. That someone is you." Before Victoria could argue further, Jenkins approached them. "Bailey, there's something you should know. Word is the Blackburns are planning to move up their timeline. My sources say they might come for the deed as soon as tomorrow." Preston's expression hardened. "They're getting nervous. El Lobo's been asking more questions about you," Jenkins confirmed. "I think they've figured out who you are." Victoria felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Tomorrow, but we're not ready. Your plans change," Preston said grimly. "We adapt." Jenkins spread the word. "Everyone needs to be ready by morning." As the meeting dispersed, people leaving in pairs or alone to avoid attention, Victoria felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her. Tomorrow could bring victory or death. There seemed no middle ground. Preston walked her back to the store in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. At her door, he paused. "Try to get some rest," he advised. "Tomorrow will be demanding." Victoria looked up at him, suddenly aware that this might be their last quiet moment together. "Preston," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "Why are you really doing this? The truth." In the moonlight, his features seemed carved from stone, beautiful and unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then so quietly she almost didn't hear, he said, "Because when I look at you, I see someone worth saving, someone worth fighting for." The simple honesty of his words stole her breath. Without thinking, Victoria reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her palm, rough with stubble. "And when I look at you," she whispered, "I see the man I've been waiting for all my life, arriving at the worst possible moment." Preston's hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his face before gently removing it. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "After tomorrow, don't," she interrupted. "Don't make promises about after, not yet." He nodded, understanding. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Lock your door," he reminded her, then turned and walked away toward the stables. Victoria watched him go, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. Tomorrow they might both die, or they might free Canon City from the Blackburns' tyranny. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. With that thought echoing in her mind, she entered the store and locked the door behind her, preparing for whatever the dawn would bring. Victoria woke before sunrise, her sleep having been fitful and filled with fragments of dreams her father's face, blood on the store floor, Preston standing between her and shadowy figures with guns drawn. She rose and dressed quickly in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, her hair pinned severely back. After a moment's hesitation, she retrieved her father's shotgun from beneath her bed and loaded it. A soft knock at the back door startled her. Gun in hand, she approached cautiously. "Victoria, it's me." Preston's voice brought both relief and a fresh wave of anxiety. She unlocked the door to find him looking as if he hadn't slept at all, his face drawn but determined. "They're coming," he said without preamble. Jenkins' source confirmed it. The Blackburns rode out from their ranch an hour ago, all 5 of them plus the sheriff. Victoria's mouth went dry. "So soon, it's barely dawn." "They want to catch us unprepared." Preston entered, closing the door behind him. "Our people are moving into position, but we're scrambling." "What should I do?" Preston's eyes swept the store, calculating. "Open as usual, act normal. When they come in, try to keep them talking as long as possible. Every minute gives our people more time to get ready." Victoria nodded, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "And you?" "I'll be close," he promised. "But not visible at first. We need them all inside before we spring the trap." A sudden thought occurred to Victoria. "The deed, they'll want to see it." "Show them a false one," Preston suggested. "Anything to buy time." Victoria shook her head. "They'll know." "My father was meticulous with his records. The deed has specific markings." She crossed to the fireplace in the living quarters and removed the loose brick, extracting a leather folder. "Here it is, the real deed." Preston examined the document. "Keep it on you." "If things go wrong, I know," Victoria interrupted. "Run for Denver." Their eyes met, and Victoria saw something in Preston's gaze that made her heart stutter, a warmth that went beyond concern for an innocent caught in danger. Without thinking, she stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast beneath her palm. "Be careful," she whispered. Preston's hand covered hers. "You too." For a breathless moment, Victoria thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, his expression returning to one of professional determination. "Open the store in 30 minutes. Act natural. I'll be watching." After he left, Victoria spent the remaining time fortifying herself with coffee and checking her shotgun repeatedly. When the town clock struck 7, she unlocked the front door of the store and turned the sign to open, just as she would on any normal day. The first hour passed in tense silence. No customers came, which wasn't surprising. Word had likely spread that trouble was brewing at Parker's general store. Victoria busied herself with straightening shelves and updating the ledger, all while keeping one eye on the street through the front windows. At 8:15, she spotted them 6 riders approaching slowly down the main street, their horses moving at a deliberate walk that seemed designed to intimidate. Even from a distance, Victoria could identify Jeb Blackburn by his distinctive black hat and the confident way he sat his horse. Beside him rode Sheriff Wilson, his badge catching the morning sun. Victoria's hands began to tremble. She placed them flat on the counter to steady them, drawing a deep breath. This was it. Everything they had planned for would happen in the next few minutes. People would likely die, perhaps herself among them. Yet underneath her fear was a steely resolve that surprised her. These men had murdered her father. Whatever happened now, she would face them with the same courage he had shown. The riders stopped in front of the store. Jeb Blackburn dismounted first, followed by his brothers and their hired guns. Sheriff Wilson remained on his horse, looking uncomfortable. Victoria could see other townspeople watching from windows and doorways, some of whom she recognized from last night's meeting. Were they in position? Was Preston ready? The bell above the door jangled as Jeb Blackburn entered, followed by his brothers Lyle and Emmett. El Lobo and Simmons remained outside, watching the street. The sheriff stayed mounted, ostensibly keeping lookout. Jeb Blackburn was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a face marked by an old knife scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Victoria with predatory interest. "Miss Parker," he greeted, his voice deceptively cordial. "Sorry about your pa, unfortunate business." Victoria's grip on the counter tightened. "What do you want, Mr. Blackburn?" he chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Straight to business, I like that." He removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "I believe you know why we're here." "Your pa and I had an arrangement." "You had no arrangement," Victoria corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. "You demanded money, he refused, and you murdered him." Lyle Blackburn, the youngest brother, laughed. Got spirit, this one, just like her old man. Jeb silenced his brother with a glare. Miss Parker, I'm a reasonable man. I offered your father protection. He declined. That was his choice. His eyes hardened. Now I'm offering you a choice. Sign over the deed to this store and you can leave town with your life and whatever you can carry. Victoria needed to buy time. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement across the street. Samuel Cooper positioning himself in the doorway of his blacksmith shop, a rifle partially concealed behind his leg. And if I refuse? She asked, already knowing the answer. Emmett Blackburn, the middle brother, drew his gun and placed it on the counter, the implied threat clear. Then you'll join your pa. Victoria fought to keep her expression neutral. The deed isn't here, it's at the bank in a lockbox. Jeb's eyes narrowed suspiciously. You're lying. Wilson said your pa kept it here, behind a brick in the fireplace. The revelation that the sheriff had been inside her home searching for the deed sent a chill through Victoria. Things change, she said. After what happened to my father, I moved it. Get Wilson in here, Jeb ordered his youngest brother. As Lyle moved toward the door, a shot rang out from across the street. Lyle stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as blood blossomed on his shirt. Ambush, he shouted. Everything happened at once. Emmett grabbed Victoria, using her as a shield as he dragged her away from the counter. Jeb overturned a display table for cover, drawing his gun. Outside, more shots were fired as El Lobo and Simmons returned fire toward Cooper's blacksmith shop. Bailey, Jeb shouted, I know you're out there. Show yourself or the woman dies. Victoria struggled against Emmett's grip, her heart racing. Where was Preston? Had something gone wrong with their plan? The back door of the store burst open and Preston appeared, his gun aimed steadily at Emmett. Let her go, Blackburn. Emmett tightened his hold, pressing his gun against Victoria's temple. Drop your weapon, Ranger, or I put a bullet in her brain. Preston's eyes met Victoria's, a silent communication passing between them. She gave the barest nod, understanding what he needed her to do. All right, Preston said, lowering his gun slowly. Just don't hurt her. As Preston's gun lowered, Victoria drove her elbow hard into Emmett's stomach. He doubled over, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. Preston's gun came up in an instant, firing twice. Emmett collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Jeb roared with rage, firing wildly at Preston, who dove behind a shelf for cover. Victoria scrambled toward the counter where her shotgun was hidden. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Through the window, Victoria could see Sheriff Wilson fleeing on horseback, abandoning his Blackburn paymasters. El Lobo was exchanging shots with someone on the hotel roof, Mrs. Abernathy, Victoria realized with astonishment. Jeb's attention was fixed on Preston, giving Victoria the chance she needed. She grabbed her shotgun and raised it just as Jeb emerged from behind the overturned table, aiming at Preston's exposed position. Blackburn, Victoria shouted. He turned, surprise registering on his face as he found himself staring down the barrel of her shotgun. This is for my father, Victoria said, and pulled the trigger. The blast caught Jeb Blackburn square in the chest, throwing him backward against the wall. He slid to the floor, leaving a crimson streak behind him, his eyes wide with shock as the life drained from them. For a moment, the store was eerily quiet, the only sound Victoria's ragged breathing and the continued gunfire outside. Then Preston was beside her, gently taking the shotgun from her trembling hands. Are you hurt? He asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Victoria shook her head, unable to speak. She had just killed a man. No matter how justified, the weight of that action pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. Preston seemed to understand. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. Stay here, he said. I need to help the others. Before he could move toward the door, it burst open. Simmons staggered in, blood streaming from a wound in his side. His gun was trained unsteadily on them. You're dead, Bailey, he rasped. Both of you. Preston pushed Victoria behind him, shielding her with his body, but before Simmons could fire, another shot rang out from the doorway. The hired gun crumpled to the floor, revealing Lily Jenkins standing in the entrance, her father's pistol still smoking in her hand. That's for what your friends did to me, she said to the dead man, her voice shaking but resolute. Victoria moved to the young woman, taking the gun gently from her hands. "Are you all right, Lily?" The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on Simmons. "Pa sent me to help. Is it? Is it over?" Preston moved to the window, assessing the situation outside. "Lyle's down. Cooper and his apprentice have him cornered. El Lobo." He paused, his expression darkening. "El Lobo's making a run for it." Without another word, Preston strode out the door, his gun drawn. Victoria wanted to call him back to tell him to let the Mexican go, but she knew he wouldn't listen. This was personal for him, a debt of justice that had been building since El Paso. Victoria led Lily to a chair, then went to check on the Blackburn brothers. Emmett was dead, Preston's bullets having found their mark with deadly accuracy. Jeb lay where he had fallen, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Victoria felt no satisfaction in his death, only a hollow relief that her father's killers had faced justice. Outside, a final shot echoed down the street, then silence. Victoria held her breath, waiting, praying that it wasn't Preston who had fallen. Long minutes passed before the door opened again. Preston stood there, his shirt stained with blood, a fresh cut on his cheek but very much alive. "El Lobo?" Victoria asked. "Won't be troubling anyone again," Preston replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Victoria nodded, understanding the finality of his words. The debt was paid. The past was settled. Gradually, the town began to emerge from hiding. Dr. Morris arrived to tend to the wounded, including Lyle Blackburn, who had survived his injuries and was now under Cooper's watchful guard. Sheriff Wilson was nowhere to be found, having fled in the direction of the territorial border. By noon, a semblance of order had been restored to Canon City. The bodies of the dead Blackburns and their hired guns were taken to the undertaker. Reverend Williams organized a town meeting to discuss what would happen next. The telegraph operator sent messages to Denver, requesting a new sheriff and reporting the day's events. Through it all, Preston remained at Victoria's side, his steady presence grounding her amid the chaos. When the last of the townspeople had left and Victoria was finally alone in her store with him, the full impact of what had occurred hit her like a physical blow. "They're gone," she said, sinking onto a chair. "It's over." Preston knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Yes, it's over." Victoria searched his face, looking for signs of what he might be feeling: relief, triumph, regret. What she found was something more complex, a mix of emotions she couldn't fully decipher. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Preston's thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands, a gentle, comforting gesture. "The town elects a new sheriff. Life goes on. Canon City has a chance to be what it should have been all along." "And you?" Victoria couldn't keep the question inside any longer. "What happens to you now?" Preston Bailey. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "That depends," he finally said. "On what?" "On you," Preston admitted. "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." Victoria's heart seemed to stop, then restart at a gallop. "You'd stay, here in Canon City?" A small smile touched his lips. "I've been drifting a long time, Victoria, looking for something I wasn't sure existed. A place that needed what I could offer, people worth fighting for." His hand reached up to touch her cheek. "I found more than I expected." The tenderness in his touch, in his voice, made Victoria's breath catch. "I don't want you to stay out of obligation," she said, "or pity." Preston's smile widened. "Pity is the last thing I feel when I look at you, Victoria Parker." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, questioning rather than demanding, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Victoria found herself responding, her hands moving to his shoulders, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I walked into this store," he confessed. "Even with everything happening around us, all I could think was how brave you were, how beautiful." Victoria smiled through the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. "And I thought you were a madman, offering to help a stranger against impossible odds." "Maybe I was," Preston agreed. "Or maybe I just knew a good cause when I saw one." He stood, drawing her up with him. "I can't promise it will be easy," he warned. "I've made enemies, and this town will take time to heal." Victoria placed her hand over his heart. "Nothing worth having comes easy, my father used to say." She looked around the store that had been her family's dream, now marred by violence but still standing. "We'll rebuild, together." Preston's arms encircled her, holding her close as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "Together," he agreed softly. Outside, Canon City was beginning to come alive again. People were emerging from their homes, talking in the streets, sharing the news that the Blackburn's reign of terror was over. A new chapter was beginning for the town, and for Victoria Parker, who had believed no one would help her until a cowboy walked in and said those simple words that had changed everything. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows through the windows of Parker's general store, Victoria looked up at the man who had risked everything for her and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that the future held promise after all. 5 years later, Victoria Bailey stood on the porch of Parker's general store, watching as her husband helped their 3-year-old son, Thomas, mount his first pony. The little boy's face was alight with excitement, his father's blue eyes shining with pride as tiny hands gripped the saddle horn with determination. "Not too fast, Preston," Victoria called, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their second child grew. "He's still so small." Preston looked up with a grin that still made her heart skip after all these years. "He's a natural, Victoria, just like his mother." She smiled, remembering how Preston had taught her to ride properly during their courtship. Those had been heady days, filled with the excitement of rebuilding not just the store but the entire town. Canon City had transformed in the years since the Blackburn's fall, growing into a thriving community where law and order prevailed. Preston had initially declined the townspeople's offer to become sheriff, preferring instead to help Victoria run the store while serving as a deputy when needed. When Marshal Collins from Denver arrived to investigate the shootout, he had brought with him official recognition of Preston's past service as a Texas Ranger and a commendation for his role in bringing down the Blackburn Gang. Their wedding had taken place 6 months after that fateful day, a celebration that the entire town attended. Victoria had walked down the aisle of the newly built church on Dr. Morris's arm, the elderly physician proudly standing in for her father. Lily Jenkins, now courting Cooper's apprentice Caleb, had been her maid of honor. Life had settled into a rhythm that Victoria cherished: mornings in the store, evenings on the porch watching the sunset, nights in Preston's arms. When Thomas had arrived 2 years into their marriage, their happiness had seemed complete. Now, with another child on the way, Victoria sometimes marveled at how differently things might have turned out if Preston hadn't walked through her door that terrible day. As if reading her thoughts, Preston lifted Thomas from the pony and carried him up to the porch, the boy chattering excitedly about his ride. "Mama, did you see? I rode all by myself," Victoria laughed, smoothing her son's dark hair. "I saw, sweetheart, you were very brave." Like Papa when he fought the bad men, Victoria and Preston exchanged a glance. They had never hidden the truth of how they met from their son, though they had simplified the more violent aspects of the story. "Yes," Preston said, setting Thomas down, "but being brave isn't just about fighting. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." He looked at Victoria, his expression softening. "Your mother is the bravest person I know." Thomas considered this seriously. "Because she wasn't afraid of the bad men. She was afraid," Preston corrected gently. "But she stood her ground anyway. That's true courage." Victoria felt a rush of love for this man who had become not just her husband but her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had built a life and a family in the shadow of tragedy, finding joy where once there had been only despair. "Thomas, why don't you go help Mrs. Jenkins set the table?" Victoria suggested, nodding toward Lily, who had become their shop assistant after her marriage to Caleb. "Dinner will be ready soon." As their son scampered off, Preston moved to Victoria's side, his hand coming to rest beside hers on her rounded belly. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than yesterday," she assured him. "Dr. Morris says another month, perhaps less." Preston's eyes crinkled with the smile that was reserved only for her. "I'm hoping for a girl this time, one who looks just like her mother." Victoria leaned into his embrace. "I don't care what we have as long as the baby is healthy." She paused, then added softly, "And as long as you're here with us." Preston's arms tightened around her. "Where else would I be? Everything I need is right here." The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. From inside the store came the sound of Lily's laughter, mingling with Thomas's excited chatter. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still occasional threats that required Preston's steady hand, but it was rich and full in ways Victoria could never have imagined in those dark days after her father's death. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Staying here, settling down?" Preston turned her gently to face him, his expression serious. "Not for a single moment. When I walked into this store 5 years ago, I was looking for justice, maybe even vengeance. What I found was something far more valuable." His hand cupped her cheek. "I found home, Victoria, I found you." As his lips met hers in a kiss that still held all the passion of their first, Victoria silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought this man to her door. She had believed no one would help her, and then Preston Bailey had walked in and said those 3 simple words that had changed everything. "Let me help." What neither of them could have known then was how much they would help each other, healing old wounds, building a future, creating a family bound by love that was stronger than any danger they had faced or ever would face. As darkness fell over Canon City, lamps were lit in homes across town. In the general store that still bore the Parker name alongside Bailey, a family gathered for dinner, their laughter spilling into the night air. And on the porch, a former drifter held his wife close, grateful for the day he had chosen to stop wandering and start living. Their story, which had begun in violence and fear, had transformed into one of love and hope, a testament to the power of courage, second chances, and the unexpected paths that lead us home.